This video and hundreds more like it available on freePhotoshopVideoTutorials.com. In this video, we're going to be talking about the very interesting topic of making Photoshop perform twice as fast as it normally would. So what that means is if you don't change anything and you just install Photoshop as it is and you never really touch any of the preferences, then you're not really taking advantage of all that Photoshop could take advantage of your computer. And also I'll be talking a little bit about what hardware things you can change. It's a very specific one small and actually nowadays quite cheap thing that you can do to actually make your computer run twice as fast with Photoshop. We're not talking about getting a new computer or anything. So let me just get to it. So first thing you need to do is go to your preferences. So here on the Mac, it's going to the Photoshop menu and go to preferences. On the PC, I believe it's on the edit menu. It's preferences right there. Either way, go to your preferences and go to performance. And this is where we can set up Photoshop to run a lot faster than it probably normally does for you if you've never touched this. There are 4 areas here of performing the enhancements to Photoshop, making it run quicker. And the first thing that we're going to look here is the memory usage. Now, with Photoshop, it's a very memory-intensive program, which means that any time that you make any sort of adjustment to your image, if you change something, if you click, a brush somewhere or something, Photoshop is always saving all these changes into the memory so that you can have multiple undos and so forth. And one of the things you can do is actually increase the memory that Photoshop sets itself to use within your system. Now, normally, if you have less than 3 gigs of memory, I have a bit more. So you see here that my available memory shows up as 3072, which is 3 gigs of memory. And this is all it'll show for now anyways, at least on Photoshop CS3, Photoshop CS4 as well. And you'll know, you know if you have more than 3 gigs or less. But regardless, if you have less than 3 gigs, if you have less than this number, then what happens is what you want to set to Photoshop is not to use just 70%, but you want to set something that is around 85 to 90%. And the reason for that is, well, obviously you want to be able to use more memory for Photoshop so that you can run things quicker, because Photoshop will always be able to do things whether or not you have enough memory, and usually you don't. What happens is that Photoshop will then, once it runs out of its allocated memory, which would be 70% of my total memory here, it will start using the hard drive. Now, the hard drive is a lot slower by orders of magnitude than memory. So you notice that if Photoshop is being a little sluggish on a large image or something like that, it's because it's actually using your hard drive, which you have plenty of space. It's using your hard drive to do that. Now, what you can do here, of course, is, like I said, you want to leave it up to about 85 to 90% of your memory, because you still want a little bit of memory left for you to be able to run Windows or Mac OS X or any other stuff that you have running in the background. For example, you have, like an instant messenger or a browser open or something like that. You don't want other parts of your computer also having to run and use your hard drive as well, because then you will start to see that your computer starts running a little bit more sluggishly. So 85 to 90% will take care of that, and you'll be using a lot more memory for Photoshop than it normally would assign itself. So that's quite good. If you are, just on a side topic here, if you have more than 3 gigs of memory, then what you want to do is just set your memory up to 100% so that it will use all of that up, and all the other stuff that you have over that will more than cover your operating system and all this other stuff. So if you have more than 3 gigs, set it to 100%. If you have less than that, set it to about 85 to 90%. Now, the other topic here is, of course, history and cache. Now, the history states is exactly what I was talking about before, which is every little change that you make in Photoshop, it saves that little change so you can go back into your history palette and go back in and do multiple undos and so forth. By default, it comes in with 20 history states, and there isn't a right number for this. It kind of depends how much memory you have. I would suggest staying on 20. And if you start to find that your computer gets kind of sluggish after you do around 20 things or so forth, then it means that you are generally running out of memory. And of course, if you don't have more memory to put in to your computer, then you're just going to have to sort of try to make Photoshop use less memory. And the way to do that is actually to decrease the history states. Because if you decrease it to something, for example, like 8, then it will only save up to 8 changes. And that takes a lot less space than having to save the changes over 20 or 60 or 100 history states. Now, if you have a lot of memory, for example, 3 gigs here is quite a lot, for Photoshop. I mean, it's never enough, but it's, it's quite a lot. You can probably set your history states to somewhere around 50 or 60 or something like that. Just something that, if you are actually using a lot of the history state and you want to be able to go back, it's more of a convenience, really. It's not going to make, you any better having that many more history states. It's just going to take up more memory, but it gives you more flexibility. So that's where the trade-off is. So if you find your computer's being sluggish, reduce your history states. And if you find that for what you're doing, your computer's just fine, then, and you are essentially wanting to go back into more history states, but you find yourself kind of running out, increase the history states. The cache levels is a little bit different. Cache levels is Photoshop saves sort of like a snapshot of your image, and the less cache levels that you have, the less it will save these predetermined snapshots of your image to give you some previews of things and so forth. So what you want to do is just leave your cache levels as they are, and if you find that your computer is going a little bit sluggishly, reduce your cache levels. And if it's just fine, then you can maybe try to increase the cache levels. I generally leave the cache levels as they are, and only if I'm working on a slower computer or with less memory and so forth do I then reduce the cache levels for some better speed. Now, the main thing that will actually improve Photoshop going twice as fast is this area here, which is the scratch disks. Scratch disks, like I've mentioned before, is the term used for when Photoshop needs to go to your hard drive to save any modification that you're doing. And like I said, hard drives are a lot slower than memory, but you can never have enough memory. So what will happen is inevitably is you'll start going to the hard drive. If you have 20 images open, you'll definitely be, going into the hard drive. And if you are going to be going to the hard drive, it will matter a lot whether or not, depending which hard drive it's going to. Most computer users usually have just one hard drive, which means that the operating system is using that hard drive, Photoshop is using that hard drive, Firefox or anything that you have open is using that one specific hard drive. And there's a lot of little things that go on in the background. So your hard drive is going to one place to read and going to other places to read and write and so forth. There's all these little micro things going on. And when Photoshop needs to dump a lot of stuff into the hard drive, then it has to sort of divide its time between dumping all that stuff into your hard drive, which is not very quick, but it's doing that anyways because it has to. And then it also having to divide its time with all these other tasks. So it's having to do all these things, which eventually slows it down. And what you can do to make your Photoshop go twice as fast is to use one hard drive, an extra hard drive, and they're quite cheap nowadays. It doesn't need to be a big hard drive, but you need to have a separate hard drive where you can have Photoshop just dump things into. No one else is touching that hard drive but Photoshop, and this is what makes Photoshop go twice as fast. And the way that you do this, you can see here my list of hard drives. I actually have quite a few, but I have one here, about a 300 gig hard drive I set the name here to cache, and just name that just because I like the name. And what I can do is click on it to activate it, move it up by the arrows, and then untick if you want to. You're probably not going to run out of any space on a spare hard drive, but I generally just untick just to make it clear that I want Photoshop to only be using the spare hard disk. So what happens now? Well, when I run out of memory, which is pretty quick, then Photoshop will go to a hard drive that has no other use. It's not being taxed for anything else. It's just sitting there waiting. When Photoshop needs to dump something, it dumps it to the maximum speed of the hard drive. And when it needs to read something from the hard drive, it does that at maximum speed. And you'll find that this will double the speed of Photoshop when you're working with large files. It will go twice as fast as it would do by having to share it with all the other stuff. Photoshop is running from that hard drive as well. So there's all these things going on. So having one dedicated for that will double the speed. And lastly but not least is the CPU settings, which is kind of not really up to you. It's just something that shows up here. It goes like this. If you have a hard drive, if you have a graphics card that is good enough to be using some of the accelerated things that you can do in Photoshop, then it will already be enabled. And if you don't, then it will be disabled, and you can't really control that, but you can see that, here it detects my graphics card, and it sees that it does have 3D engines that can be accelerated. So it takes some of that load from Photoshop. and dumps it into my graphics card, which is another thing that can go quite a lot quicker. So this is basically how you optimize Photoshop to run a lot quicker for you. If you enjoyed this video, show your support by subscribing, rating, and adding it to favorites. Leave comments on our website and we'll create even more videos that interest you.